coming up, there is an imbalance in the global financial apparatus that takes from some countries to make others richer.
Debt is the biggest obstacle at this point to countries spending more on national development, on health, on education, on responses to the climate crisis.
On this episode, we expose what many say is an unjust system of debt and exploitation.
Rich countries ought to be paying about $4 trillion a year in climate finance to low-income countries. But that is a debt that goes unpaid and unenforced.
And what appears to be a concerted effort to suppress voices of reason and change.
I'm just getting news here that the US has withdrawn from the Loss and Damage Fund.
It is really important that other countries step up to the plate here.
Just 2 degrees is on now.
Countries in the Global South ought to be able to say, look, we are in a climate emergency. We have an emergency also in health and education. We need to finance these things first.
This was in Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, in early March. About 11 million people live there and were dealt this weather, some pretty heavy rains and flash floods. The cleanup after these types of events is always very expensive, and many countries are forced to borrow from international banks and other organizations to address these disasters. Hurricanes, heat waves, floods, and wildfires are becoming more intense. The World Health Organization says ferocious weather events have increased 400% over the past 50 years. However, human deaths have decreased threefold. Well, that's because of early warning systems, good ones, and effective disaster preparedness. Still, the majority of deaths, around 115 people every day on average in the past 5 decades, live in the Global South. The question then is how developing nations can develop a strategy to save lives and build an infrastructure resilient to increasingly erratic weather. I rang up our friends at the World Health Organization to find out what countries can do to prepare and respond to these disasters. This World Health Organization report you're talking about, it came out a while ago, and it talks about the 50 years in between 1970 and 2021, saying that there were more than 2 million people who've died during that time due to climate-related events, and there were roughly about 3.64 trillion US dollars in losses around that time. But it also says that deaths decreased threefold, which suggests improvements in early warning systems. But I wonder if there are gaps, say in Global South countries, which don't have the finances for early warning system technology.
There are certainly gaps. And as you just said, of course, extreme weather events have basically increased by a factor of 5 over 50 years. So, and this, of course, has been driven by climate change, human-induced climate change, and it's affected not just our health, but food security, water security, of course, displacement of populations as well. And you're right in the sense that the wealthier countries are faring better, but they're not less affected. Heat waves in the 35 member states of the European region claimed 100 lives over 2022 and 2023. So we've also seen the last 4 years been the 4 hottest on record. So the 4 years since 2020, the 4 hottest on record, and the European region, which is predominantly of high-income member states, middle-income member states, have seen twice the global average in terms of the way in which the European region is warming faster than any other region on the planet. Then, of course, in Europe, as we've seen, again, another high-income country, torn apart, really. The Valencia 2024 floods that claimed 200 plus lives were a huge shock to the system. And despite early warning systems, despite readiness of the health sector, these extreme weather events are still having a huge impact on all economies, from the lowest income to the highest.
You know, global warming seems to be accelerating at such a phenomenal pace, particularly over the past few years since since say 2021 even. I wonder if the WHO's apparatus has had to change and modernize to keep up with this. How does the WHO keep up?
Well, one thing we've done is the new global program of work. That is, if you like, our global health policy and strategy for the next 5 years has climate change at its center point. And that's a game changer. That is the major shift between the last 5 and the coming 5 years. And it's the same in the European region where I work. So that's one thing we can do, is to bring the policy to a center point so that it's an all of house, all sector, all health component lift to support climate change and health action. In 2023, one other thing that we did, if you like, was declare in 2023 the climate crisis as a health emergency for the first time in history. And that, of course, has a game-changing impact on the way in which leadership in countries view climate change. And of course, health is an incredible driver for climate change, for transformative climate change action. And where you have, we've particularly seen action being taken in urban centers. And I think, again, this speaks to, from the lowest to the highest income countries, urban areas where 55% of the world live currently. And I think by 2050, 68% of the world will live in urban areas, where we have really acute issues with air pollution, the impact of air pollution, which just in the European region alone claims almost 500,000 lives prematurely every year. And of course, also in urban areas, heat islands, where we have extreme heat events taking place. Better preparation by municipalities, urban municipalities, has been an outcome of us advocating for transformative action on climate change, using health and our personal health and well-being as a driver, because without our health, there is nothing.
You mentioned leadership. You know, the US, obviously, the US pulled out of the Paris Accord under the Donald Trump administration, pulled out of the WHO. That is an incredibly damaging combination for you guys in particular, and even more so for the people that you support. How are you going to continue saving people's lives when you're faced with this administration, this US administration that seems hell-bent on turning your work upside down?
Well, it's one member state of 190 plus, right? That are UN member states and members of the World Health Organization. It's a very prominent and important partner, of course, the US for us. There's no denying this. The impacts are felt across infectious disease control, disease programs, non-communicable disease programs, and of course, environment and health, climate change and health, particularly. We're going to continue our work. We have a mandate and we have a responsibility to deliver support to, in my region, the region in which I work, 53 member states of the European region. So that work does not stop.
If the UN is saying that between 1970 and 2021, extreme events increased by 400%, and the UN is also predicting that things are going to get a lot worse in the coming years and decades, with the US pulling out of the climate accord, pulling out of the WHO, are you prepared to deal with what's to come?
I think we are becoming prepared. I think what we're doing now with our global program of work is, by putting climate at the center, we can draw down on all areas of WHO's work, from infectious diseases to health system strengthening, and note that everybody needs to make a lift on this. I mean, we're talking about adaptation of health systems predominantly, but we're also talking about mitigation. So let me give you an example of this. The health system contributes between 5 to 7% of all carbon emissions, of all greenhouse gas emissions globally. If the health sector were a country or a member state, it would be the 5th largest polluter on the planet. So we have a job to do within the health system as well to mitigate the impacts. And that's where WHO comes into its fore. I mean, our member states, our ministries of health are our chief constituency. So the health system and generating that support from within the health system is within our means. And it is within our means to get the lift commensurate political commitment as well that would allow us to do that, to adapt and mitigate for climate change. And we're very confident we can do that in the years to come.
So back to the topic of debt. More than 50 nations in the global south pay billions of dollars annually to pay back debt they owe international banks and organizations. But in the grand scheme of things, who really owes whom? Particularly when it's mostly emissions from the global north that sustain the cycle of climate disasters and incremental debt. Our friends at Action Aid worked hard to determine how much richer nations owe low and middle income countries.
Maybe we can just start off, David, by just giving a brief summary on how much debt constrains developing nations.
We have 54 countries that are recognized as being in debt crisis, and about 86% of countries, of all low and low middle income countries, are at significant risk of debt crisis. So debt is the biggest obstacle at this point to countries spending more on national development, on health, on education, on responses to the climate crisis, and on any other national priorities that governments determine.
There's also a conversation about the amount of wealth countries combined in the globe have, and whether or not we have this wealth, but we do not use it to solve the problems that are solvable, whether this debt is a part of a deliberate cycle of dependency that's created and maintained.
Well, there's definitely a cycle of dependency. I mean, I think many people might remember that about 20 years ago, there was a huge campaign. There was a Jubilee campaign for the cancellation of debt. And as a result of that campaign, about $100 billion of debt was cancelled. But 20 years later, we find ourselves in an even deeper debt crisis. And that's because the global architecture around debt did not change at all. First of all, you have a colonial institution, the International Monetary Fund, as the ultimate arbiter of debt. And this is an institution set up 80 years ago, before any country in Africa was independent, and with a voting structure which has been little changed since that time.
I'm just getting news here that the US has withdrawn from the Loss and Damage Fund. People are reacting already. We're getting from climate activists saying the decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from the new fund for responding to loss and damage not only exemplifies a long-standing pattern of obstruction by the US government in securing necessary finance for addressing climate impacts, but also undermines global efforts to deliver climate justice. If the US is withdrawing from this just makes everything a whole lot more difficult, doesn't it?
I mean, it's not surprising. We sort of knew that. I mean, Trump had already withdrawn from the Conference of Parties on the climate negotiations. I think we anticipated that he would withdraw from this loss and damage fund. But it is really important that other countries step up to the plate here. There is a recognized debt of the global north to the global south for having polluted the atmosphere. You know, the most systematic studies done on atmospheric appropriation estimate that the rich countries ought to be paying about $4 trillion a year in climate finance to low-income countries. But that is a debt that goes unpaid and unenforced. So you have a real imbalance of power around debt. You have much bigger debts of the global north to the global south on climate damages, you know, let alone thinking about the transatlantic slave trade or reparations for colonialism. The debts of the global north are much greater, but they're unenforced and go unpaid. Whereas the debts, the much smaller debts of the global south are brutally enforced and actually at the cost of health and education of the citizens of those countries.
Action Aid report calls for or mentions a call for a boycott of global debt. What would that look like were it to happen? It sounds as though developing countries would just stop paying what they owe. What if that were the case? What would be the consequences?
So we're saying countries in the global south ought to be able to say, look, we are in a climate emergency. We have an emergency also in health and education. We need to finance these things first. The debts that we have, those debts are there, but the rich countries who have promised us money ought to take on those debts on our behalf.
I'd love to get your perspective on the role of some global South countries that may be able to afford helping themselves a lot more. For example, India spends more on defense than it does on local public health. Do you think some developing nations help exacerbate this global status quo?
Look, there's no doubt. And I think that is a good, as I was just saying, we need to establish good and clear principles of responsible lending and borrowing. There are governments that have borrowed money in an irresponsible way and have used it not as they should have done. One of the big worries we have is that there's probably a higher level of corruption in the use of aid and loans than there is in normal public finance. So some of the challenges of building effective, accountable governments, where governments are really accountable to citizens for their spending, is more challenging when you have deals around loans done often behind closed doors with leading politicians or small elites, and without the level of transparency that is needed.
Our heating world doesn't just create more intense storms, it has a direct effect on us. Since 1999, more than 21,000 Americans have died from heat-related illness. And as global temperatures rise, scientists are discovering additional dangers to the human body. Like living in extreme heat can accelerate our biological aging process. It's not just us humans who are affected by erratic weather. Freshwater systems are as well. And some species that depend on them are at risk of disappearing forever.
4 billion people live within 3 kilometers of freshwater ecosystems like lakes, rivers, and streams. These regions also support 10% of the world's biodiversity, including some of the most unique and irreplaceable species on Earth. But there's been little data on the status of freshwater invertebrates and fish until now. In a groundbreaking study published in Nature, scientists examined nearly 24,000 freshwater species, including dragonflies, fish, and crabs. Their findings are alarming.
Almost a quarter, 24% of species, freshwater species that were measured in this study are shown to be threatened with extinction.
Crabs, crayfishes, and shrimps are at the highest risk, with 30% of these species threatened. Freshwater fishes follow closely at 26%, and dragonflies and dam selfies are not far behind at 16%. The researchers say our activities like agriculture, dam building, and overfishing have placed an enormous burden on these species. The worst hit species are found in biodiversity hotspots like Lake Victoria in East Africa, home to the endangered freshwater mollusks, and the Western Ghats of India, where the humpbacked mahseer is struggling to survive. In Sri Lanka's wet zone, unique creatures like the redfin labeo are vanishing due to habitat loss.
When you put in a dam, obviously the most obvious thing is that you're fragmenting the flow. So it means that that anything that's moving up or down the river can't do that anymore. And so it means that migratory species can't get to their spawning sites, for example. it also means that you're fragmenting those populations, so the upstream populations are no longer mixing with the downstream populations.
Pollution from agriculture and logging now threatens more than 50% of freshwater species at risk of extinction. Pesticides and fertilizers are contaminating rivers and lakes, creating dead zones where aquatic life cannot survive. Clearing land for agriculture and diverting water for irrigation is upending natural habitats. Invasive species, non-native plants, fish, and amphibians are preying on native species, accelerating decline and extinction. The introduction of the Nile perch in Lake Victoria led to the extinction of over 200 native fish species. And the study found that at least 4,000 freshwater species are at high risk of extinction due to habitat loss, pollution, and extreme weather events. Despite these threats, global efforts to track and protect these species have been underfunded. Researchers say the true number of extinctions is likely even higher due to limited monitoring of freshwater biodiversity.
If 25% of the species we know are threatened, then we can say that probably a quarter of those data deficient species are also threatened. So the numbers of threatened species are probably higher than we really know.
The data uncovered in this study can help prioritize restoration efforts, especially for countries committed to the Freshwater Challenge, which aims to restore 300,000 kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of inland waters by 2030.
Well, I mean, it is very depressing, yeah, of course, but I think one can't kind of come away from this feeling that it's hopeless, and I don't think it is hopeless. It's very challenging, but it's not hopeless.
As Mikail just mentioned, there are many species that rely on freshwater systems that are now at risk, including in Chile, which is home to a staggering number of plants and animals that are found nowhere else on the planet, including in Quilpé City, where there's a relative of the dinosaur that is at risk of extinction.
Meet the helmeted water toad. At 30 centimeters long and weighing up to a kilogram, it's one of the largest frogs in the world. Scientists call it a living fossil because genetically it hasn't changed in millions of years. But this ancient survivor is now facing a very modern problem.
Hoy en día se ve súper amenazada por factores como el cambio climático, la fragmentación de hábitat, la degradación de este ambiente y también la contaminación.
Its habitat spans from Chile's northern region of Coquimbo to the southern Chiloé Island, and it lives in rivers and lakes that crisscross dense urban areas where people dump their trash. In Valparaíso, a city on Chile's coast, illegal drainage is contaminating the toad's spawning grounds, and poor waste management is making things worse. Add to that infectious diseases, humans trapping it for food, and invasive species like trout and the African clawed frog, and it's no wonder the population has plummeted by 30% since the 1990s. The toad thrives in water temperatures of about 10 degrees Celsius in winter and 20 degrees in summer. But with the planet breaking heat records each month, life is increasingly difficult. Yet this isn't the first time the helmeted toad has faced extinction-level threats, and it's not giving up without a fight.
Este estero cruza toda la ciudad y se ve afectado por los desagües ilegales, y aún así la rana logra sobrevivir. Entonces estas ranas tienen una cierta resistencia a estos fenómenos antrópicos.
The frog is found mostly in central Chile's biodiversity hotspots, teeming with wetlands, lakes, rivers, and ponds. About 2/3 of the species here are found nowhere else on the planet. Scientists say protecting river basins like Marga Marga, Mataquito, Maule, and Bayo Bayo is crucial. These areas are under stress from dam building, agricultural waste, and pollution. And experts say preserving these basins could safeguard not just the toad, but other life too.
Si esta rana desaparece, muchas especies también relacionadas a esta rana también se ven afectadas. Aves migratorias, qué sé yo, peces también nativos. Entonces, está esta enseñanza que uno ve como la cadena trófica lineal, pero en verdad, más que nada es un equilibrio, que no es que sea algo bueno o malo, sino que tú pierdes un eslabón, que sería como una piedra angular, se desequilibra todo, entonces todo falla, el equilibrio ya no está en su nivel.
The helmeted water toad shares its habitat with 33 other native frog species. One may already be extinct, and 19 others are threatened, critically endangered, or vulnerable.
Así que, pucha, es muy como triste saber que una especie que logró convivir con los dinosaurios, que logró resistir a una extinción masiva, hoy en día esté súper amenazada por la culpa, ¿cierto?, del ser humano.
Now the fight is intensifying to make sure this remarkable living fossil lives on.
And that's our show. We spoke a lot about the impact of climate change on poorer nations, but every country experiences it in one way or another, even those that do not support the idea of climate reparations. Here are images from Australia, which was hit by major floods in February. This country has the resources to recover.